and your thesis was that you were bringing together two initially incompatible paradigms, Deleuzean theory and theories of national identity in cinema. As part of that, I also wondered about a further, possibly initially apparent disparity between theories of representation and metaphoric readings of film and Deleuze's reaction against the use of representation in response to images and the metaphoric use of images. Mm-hmm. And I just was wondering how you reconciled those.
They're very good questions, quite difficult questions as well. The first one is easier to answer personally. The second one, a little bit harder. I'm not sure I have necessarily reconciled them. The first question you asked me is about national identity, theories of national identity and Deleuze and how to bring these two things together. I thought it was vital. The point of my work really was to try and bring Deleuze into film studies. One of the ways I wanted to do that was to bring it into national context, because that is still how film studies predominantly functions, even though there's all kinds of problems with the sort of model of the nation and so on. Now, I looked through different theories of national identity for what I was looking for, and I settled on Homi Bhabha in the end. It's much more elaborated on in the text than it is in my the paper I gave. But the linkage was the issue of time. So narrative time brings together Homi Bhabha and Deleuze, and these two things come together. So if I say this book is about post-colonialism, it is in a very loose sense. It's about a sort of a moment when we have reconsideration of different national histories by looking at time. So this was where I thought the linkage was that could bring Deleuze in with national identity. But the problem, of course, I have then is I'm using Deleuze, already a convoluted theorist, with Bhabha, another convoluted theorist. I tried to make them as user-friendly as I could. I hope I achieved that. So that's my answer to the first one. The linkage was time. The second one is much more difficult. As you rightly state, Deleuze is very anti the idea of representation, anti the idea of signifieds and signifieds, and is much more into becomings and planes and so on. And here I am reading these texts as allegorical and metaphorical. That's true. Ultimately, I'm going to have to fall back on the good old Deleuze answer of the toolbox. If Deleuze says you should take bits from people's philosophy and use them to make your own, then that's what I'm doing with Deleuze. Again, I think the serious answer is I'm trying to bring Deleuze into film studies. I'm trying to show that if we just use Deleuze, to look at films, it doesn't help the majority of people who don't function in that way. So I wanted to bring it in a way which people could use in a broader sense. So I make no apologies for using Deleuze against the grain, but that's what I'm doing.
Yes, thank you very much.
I wanted to go to the films predominantly first. You mentioned Memento at the end of your paper.
Yes.
And that was an interesting choice. I mean, I was also thinking of Irreversible.
Yeah.
And I believe you mentioned that in the book, which I haven't read yet. Looking forward to. No, really.
It gets a brief mention at the end, but that's all.
Okay. This is my question. Putting two parts. Putting aside the question of national identity just for a second, for the first part of the question, and looking at the form of the films Memento, Irreversible and Peppermint Candy, all of which, if you like, take a step backwards each scene, each sequence. Memento to me seems to be organically motivated out by the illness that the character has in that text. Whereas Peppermint Candy and Irreversible seem to be more motivated by the very form itself, that you can take a step backwards. Now, you mentioned that Peppermint Candy is grounded in historical events, Irreversible isn't grounded in that way. I mean, there's a revenge narrative there. I mean, you could argue that Peppermint Candy has got a kind of more of a biography of a character set against historical events. But seeing as these films, if you like, all take a step backwards, they're all form, and there seems to be Sliding Doors does something paradoxically a bit more radical than that. It puts in two parallel pathways and shows different possibilities of different lives, whereas Memento, Irreversible and Peppermint Candy to a certain extent show the irreversible nature of life, that you're caught up in a stream of events and looking for the cause of the final event that you end up in the movie. So that was the first part of my question. And I would say that's putting apart national identity. If I introduce the national identity back into it for the second part of the question, I take your point that Peppermint Candy is obviously setting itself up against some of these various anchor points in Korean history, if you like, and rendering them through a character's behaviour. That's something that Irreversible doesn't seem to do. It seems to be, if you like, just a pure narrative. So these three films, Memento, Irreversible and Peppermint Candy and Stepping Back in Time, do you think Irreversible you can read that through national identity, and do you think Memento, you can read that and it will give you some kind of idea of American identity? So, two questions.
Okay, well, the first thing is it's worth noting that Memento is not a backwards narrative in the same way that Irreversible and Peppermint Candy are, because it doesn't. It begins at the beginning and the end, and it meets in the middle, and it's not the same kettle of fish. Obviously, I do think you can read Memento in terms of national identity. I'll go into that in a minute. Irreversible, I'd rather leave out of this because it's really not in my field. I mention it in the conclusion, and I refer to other people's works to show how this could be done, but it's beyond my capabilities. The thing I'm trying to get away from is this idea that if you look at film form and you then draw conclusions from it, you have your conclusion. Because if you have that, you can look at Sliding Doors, Run Lola Run, you can say they're like chaos theory. It's just like the butterfly flapping its wings. And it patently isn't, because what these films are trying to suggest they have an ideological message. They want to tell you something, and that takes, in my opinion, that takes away from this idea that anything goes and re-territorialises them into something much more specific. The answer that I would give to your question is, if these films show there's an irreversible thrust of life, why? What is the why that they give for that? It can't just be that narratives are linear and that's it. There must be some why. I think in Peppermint Candy it is the clearest, because it says the state was so strong, it was a dictatorship. We wanted to change, we couldn't change. In Memento, it's much more difficult, and on the surface, I wouldn't expect anyone to look at Memento and say, yep, that's definitely about American national identity, that film with the Australian guy in the lead. But I would say if you read it in relationship to what else was going on in North American, US cinema at that time, you can see something happening there in a film like Saving Private Ryan, in this post-Gulf War moment. You had a representation of time which was based on America reaffirming its triumphal national identity after the defeat in Vietnam, after the end of the Cold War. They have a war in the Gulf. They can win this war, if you want to call it that, victory. And then these films come out which go back to the Second World War, and they start showing this triumphal nature of national identity. And I'm saying basically that Memento is a deconstruction of this kind of triumphal myth, both in its narrative content, in which you see a man getting away with murder by pretending to be someone he's not, and this happens to happen in an abandoned oil refinery in California, which you could argue is one of the reasons why there were oil wars happening.
Very good.
And it happens not only in the narrative content, which deconstructs something like Saving Private Ryan, which begins at the end and flashes forward to the beginning and so on, to show something inevitable. Memento, which doesn't, it kind of confuses you as to what's inevitable or not. But also in this structure, because if you watch Saving Private Ryan, there's all this whole dialogue with the shaking hand and this organic form of a guy who goes to Europe, and he's a good old American guy, and his organic body is struggling to deal with the fact that he has to kill people, but he kills people because he has to do it, and it's justified in the name of the nation. In Memento, you've got this tattooed hand, and the tattoo tells a lie, and every time the guy reads it, he reaffirms his point of origin, his point of identity, and it's a lie, and he lies to himself to get away with murder. And I think this is just different things that are happening, different ways of looking at the same story coming from one national cinema.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Oh no.
Are we certain that he gets away? I mean, we're not really certain. Sorry, this rather leads us astray, but I thought Memento hinges on the unreliability of all the participants. So unless one's going to allow that one of them, elevate one of them to the voice of truth, you see, it then becomes a much more interesting text, it seems to me, in that actually what you've got is not somebody who's concerned about the Gulf War or the problem of oil, but you've got somebody who's an everyman. And like every man, he's actually trying to organise some sort of structure. We've all done it. Wouldn't be here otherwise. Within which to live his life. And that structure actually contains delusions. And those delusions give rise to misrecognitions. You know, at the end when he says, now where was I? You know full well that he has no idea where he is.
Yeah, he
but
does
then
not.
Who does?
He doesn't know.
He
doesn't know that he's, if you like, betrayed himself.
It all
He's
hinges.
tricked
It all
himself,
hinges on whether or not he's bluffing.
Well, it all hinges on, I forget the name of the other chap, on whether that chap is actually telling him the truth.
Teddy.
Exactly, precisely.
Well, there's that little bit of hocus pocus trickery in the film, isn't there? Where in one of his flashbacks, he actually sees himself in the role of Sammy Jenkins. Now, you've got to take that as being a definite possibility that it could have been him.
Absolutely.
But the thing I would say about the context in this, if you take this as just an everyman and it's a nice universal story, I can't accept that because of the way this film plays with sort of the genre. Well, it's not a genre, is it? But film noir as its setting, as its style, and as its content.
Sorry, it's not a universal story insofar as it's not so much of an issue in traditional societies where identities are ascribed to a much greater degree in our society, whereas where identity is up for grabs. So in other words, in a traditional society, your problem is not finding an identity and organising. Your problem, this is what religion was all about, was actually living up to certain collective social ideals. Whereas in our society, because there is a plurality of ideals, almost innumerable number of them, then the problem is actually getting any sort of order in your life. Sorry, this takes us miles from what we should be talking about. You talk a great deal, and very interestingly, in your book about, and you mentioned some of these terms, linearity, the labyrinth, and the one I was particularly interested in, actually, I thought was very useful, ungrounding. These are not terribly prominent in Deleuze's own work, are they? I wonder whether you could say something about the relationship between these concepts of yours. I mean, obviously, labyrinth, say, would be the Borges story.
Which comes into cinema too, chapter 4.
But for you, they're organising. They're your central concepts, aren't they?
Absolutely, yes.
And this is not quite the case with Deleuze. I wonder whether you could say something about the relationship between Deleuze and your own concepts.
Yeah, it's something I've talked to several people about, and my answer is basically that to write a book, I had to focus on something. Everyone has done that in their own way. Yeah. Anna and Barbara have been working very much on the aesthetics, and someone like Laura Marx uses Deleuze in very specific ways, relating him to various other theorists and using him to look at certain types of cinema. For me, the point was narrative time. So yes, I focus on the labyrinth, and it is the case that I say, in broad terms, the movement image is X, and in broad terms, the time image is Y, and these have different temporal schemas in broad terms. It's not the same in all films by any means at all. But it enabled me to say what I wanted to say by taking these pieces and focus on them. I think one of the things with Deleuze, everyone talks about the richness of Deleuze and all the things you could take from it. It's also a very hampering aspect of Deleuze because there's so much there. Sometimes where do you begin? I mean, if you try to reconcile the way Anna's looking at Deleuze with the way I'm looking at Deleuze, you have, you know, text and text to actually try and put these two things together, in my opinion. So this is, you have to just do the thing you can do.
But isn't that the wonder of Deleuze?
Well, yes, you could look at it in that way. But then we're back to our usual get-out argument. It's a toolkit. I pick up the spanner instead of the hammer this time.
Which is what he wants.
Yes, exactly.
Could I ask you to expand something that wasn't in the paper, but some aspect of both of the books that really interests me? You talked in. I've got to agree. I like the way you talk about the movement image and the time image, and complicating the nature of their arrangement rather than the very handy. There's book one, there's book two, and between them is not only 2 years of writing, if you like, but a chasm, a completely different semiotic. And I think a lot of that mistake that a lot of writers have made while doing that comes because of the Bergson comment that time and matter are different in kind, so people are looking at the books as being two semiotics different in kind. So I really do agree with what you said about the complex nature of that. You talked in very general terms about the movement image and the time image as indirect representations of time and direct representations of time in organic organisations. But of course the movement image has a massive taxonomy internal to it.
Oh yes.
Starting with perception, affection and action, then being expanded through the gaseous and liquid and the solid, to then through Peirce, the impulse image, big, degradation of images and relation images and reflection images, dream images, and then recollection images. You get this whole massive taxonomy that kind of spirals out from the book. And of course, Deleuze isn't consistent in how he represents that at all. And both, Bogues particularly had trouble trying to tabulate that. But of course, the time image has its taxonomies as well. You've got crystal image, if you like, which, and these to me, rather than, if you like, forming a whole kind of network, seem to be kind of like different ways that you can talk about the time image. But you've got the crystal image, you've got this whole chronosign stuff of shoots of the past beats. Bodies, brains, all of that. I just wanted to ask you, how useful do you think this, if you like, this absolutely spiralling taxonomy is in dealing with cinema? Or do you feel it's just taking you mentioned Camoli and the Boni, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Is it taking what they did and doing it too many times?
Yeah, it's funny. The thing that always strikes me about the text is as well as what you're quite correctly saying. I think you've put together a grid showing all these different things.
I put several grids together, several different ways.
With a labour of love, which must have taken you weeks.
I'm still working on it, mate.
I also, having gone through the process of completing the book and feeling very good that I have, I look at the Deleuze's cinema text and I wonder if an editor had the nerve to say to him at any point, would you like to reduce the length of your sentences slightly or something like that? Because it seemed that perhaps he had some leeway to publish, if you like, what he liked. And so I think that there is an element of perhaps self-indulgence in the number of things that he says. On the other hand, he seems to be coming from a tradition where that's what you do. And whether or not they're useful, I think it depends on what you're looking for and what you need from it. To me, one of the most interesting things in the cinema too is that not only do you get the material that I'm focusing on and working with, but you also get, almost as an aside, his work on modern political cinema, which is now what we're calling minor cinema. And this is in itself just another thing. But again, to me, it's difficult to reconcile what that does and what a chronosign is and does, what the crystal of time is. These things are they're related, but they're incredibly different. So I think the rigour of saying this sign is called this sign is called this. I think this is from his philosophical background, where he was trying to show how his philosophical approach related to cinema, and you could see it. So maybe in a way he was working like someone like Christian Metz was working. He was saying, I have a framework for looking at life and language or whatever it is, and here it is in cinema, functioning cinema. So I think it's because of that. How we use it, I think, should be down to the people in film studies or whichever discipline who start to use it and say, well, if I just work with that as it is, I'm not going to go any further than Deleuze, probably. But if I use it in my way, maybe I can.
Sorry, just to put you in the hot seat for a second, could you name a book on cinema that is actually more interesting than Deleuze Cinema 1 and 2?
Hollywood.
And can you actually... Thank you, David. And could you actually cite a book on cinema in which fewer words are wasted? I think one of the most remarkable things, and I find that it's once wonderful, but also it's damn hard work, is that when you start to make notes on it, the notes are almost as long as
writing again.
Exactly, because he doesn't waste a single word in it. There's almost no... Well, in fact, I can't think of any padding or flannel in the whole 2 volumes.
I suppose if I depreciate, if that's the right word, if I am cheeky about Deleuze, it's for the simple reason that working with Deleuze in film studies, my major experience has been to come forward as a PhD student a few years ago now and say, I'm working with Deleuze. And the reactions I got from people in academia in film studies were often either polite or verging to dismissive. And I heard all kinds of things. Deleuze is not very interesting. Deleuze is boring. Why are you bothering with Deleuze? You don't need Deleuze. And so on and so on. So what I try and do, I think, is not come forward as someone who celebrates Deleuze for Deleuze, because it's off-putting to a lot of people who will pick up the cinema books and think, well, this is the work of someone outside the discipline who isn't, when he wrote, perhaps wasn't aware of the most recent advances in the discipline. And they can perhaps be a bit confused as to why he was important.
Do you agree with those comments?
Well, in the sense of, if you look at the way these 2 texts come across, there is a Hollywood product and then there's a European art film product. And one is, I think, in my opinion, valorised over the other. I think the time image is valorised over the movement image.
Despite all the caveats he puts in place about movement image being as beautiful, the only difference, he says, is really that they render time differently. But of course, the crux is that one gives you freedom and one doesn't.
It's apparent which of those 2 types of cinema he likes writing about.
Yeah.
Talk about, he is at times dismissive of popular genre films as being, I can't remember his words now, but he talks about kung fu films as something you have to get through before you can get to the politically engaged cinemas and this kind of thing.
One thing that I was wondering about, you talk about David Boswell's
art cinema.
Yeah, Eurocentric view of the art movie. But isn't really what the book is doing in one sense, on one level, on one plane, applying 2 distinct forms of narrativity to explore your theme. So one form of narrativity is linear, perhaps corresponding to Hollywood conventions, neatly tied up endings and action-based character driving the plot along. And the other kind being labyrinthine. Doesn't the other kind being labyrinthine, on one plane, only on one plane, correspond to Boswell's European art cinema category?
Yeah. Well, yes, and this is why I think to a lot of people, I think one of the problems was Deleuze's texts were translated a few years after they appeared anyway, so they appeared even more behind the times. It is apparent that he doesn't reference much beyond Cahiers du Cinéma, so he's not aware of what's happening in Anglo-American film studies. And if he had been aware of this sort of defining difference between David Boswell's stance in 79 and Steve Neal's in 81, which is you can look at art cinema as a sort of a form which maybe homogenises these different art films, or as something that's produced by different countries and in different ways, maybe his conclusions would have been different. So I was trying to look at, by looking at several different national contexts, the ways in which that might be seen to be the case. What was your original question?
So
I've lost the...
I've reached my age in memory of that sort of thing, so I'm afraid that question has gone forever. I'd like to just engage in a little bit of a rant and then come to a question. And that surely one of the most disgraceful episodes in modern British intellectual life was the attempt to prevent Derrida receiving a degree at Cambridge University, an honorary degree, and that his way was blocked by academics, quite amazingly people of the stature of Quine, who plainly had neither read his work nor put in the time to understand it. Now, isn't it actually, I mean, I salute your bravery in taking on Deleuze in the climate you describe. I don't want to ruin your career, so I won't actually ask you to respond to this, but it would seem to me that it is an intellectual scandal of almost similar proportions that Deleuze is being dismissed by academics who just cannot be bothered to do the work. And this is an intellectual scandal. However, to come to an issue which perhaps you would like to comment on, because I think actually you make some, you've already touched on it, that Deleuze is, I mean, sorry, just before we do come to it seems to me that in a sense what's been criticised of Deleuze is that he's been criticised for being a very poor car mechanic, when he actually is doing something completely different. He isn't doing car mechanics, he's actually an artist, well, he's as creative as an artist, and the terms just don't apply. However, to come to the point, which, as I say, you just touched on, history, it does seem to me that perhaps Deleuze's books would actually be a great deal stronger if he dropped the few references he has to history as a causal factor, history as producing a crisis in the timing, that, as you brought out very well, I thought, in the talk and in the book, this just doesn't stand up, because there have been many, many other crises, and as you point out, there are many other cinemas around at the time of this crisis. Now, how is it that this same crisis produces, on the one hand, the text he wants?
And what happens if there's another crisis? Do you get another kind of, is there a third?
Well, he clearly is marked by a moment, but then that is not in a way to criticise him too much, because clearly
I think that you can make too much of that in Deleuze's book about that historical moment. I think to me it comes more across like a tipping point, and he does refer back to a number of filmmakers who are, who invented the time image, Ozu, Renoir, Wells, people like that, and there's others. So I think you can make too much of that, of that crisis, and perhaps he makes too much of that crisis. I don't know. That's my feeling.
Well, in response to your rant, if I could say without ruining my career, we can always cut this.
We can indeed.
Okay. Well, I for all the things that I say about Deleuze being problematic, I thoroughly believe there is a lot for us to gain from using Deleuze in film studies, but I also appreciate that for the majority of people and as well as what they are doing. Now, I wouldn't say to anyone who likes working with psychoanalytic frameworks or sort of post-theoretical cognitive scientific frameworks, or any other way that they want to work, they should do Deleuze. If I thought there was something that was a crossover that might be interesting to people, I'd mention it, and I would be very passionate and enthused about Deleuze. But I think we all have to have the ability to work with what we want. I think it's a shame. I think it's a shame that Deleuze's texts, when you read them, if you have been brought up in this film studies context in recent decades, which I have, they do appear to lack some things we like to see. So some analysis of the text. Now, Conrad, you have to admit, he's not very strong on that. So he's got his big ideas, and then he talks about how they exist in films, but do you ever see him break a scene down and actually show you something in a way that you can understand?
He breaks scenes down in relation to Wells, for example, but I don't think, I mean, this comes back to my point about him being accused of being a very poor car mechanic, when in fact he's an architect. That he isn't doing that. What it seems to me Deleuze is saying is, when you go to the cinema, if you go to the right films, you're going to see something that is extraordinarily creative. It's then up to you to be equally creative. That he's not involved in what is, to be frank, some extraordinarily pedestrian academic work. I mean, as you'll have gathered from my paper earlier this morning, I'm no philosopher, but I am a historian, and I can recognise the impoverished histories when I see one. And most of what passes film studies now, it seems to me to be, again, close to an intellectual disgrace in terms of the history. It's just read off one or two headlines in newspapers. And this doesn't... Are you going to seriously explain, say, the work of Hitchcock, or Beethoven, or Shakespeare? Elizabethan England did not... They weren't all Shakespeare. That there was something about Shakespeare that is not captured by knowing about court politics, or etc., etc. And most film studies doesn't even get to that level, does it?
So are you saying there are more things in philosophy than is dreamt of in Deleuze's?
No, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, well, indeed, I mean, what Deleuze would say is, what are you doing with it? I've used Bergson, Leibniz, and so on. Right, over to you. It's a new world, because he is very clearly, and this in a way undermines what I just said, he is clearly marked by his time, isn't he? He would not write like that today. The challenge to us is, how would Deleuze write today? Which philosophers and thinkers would he use today? And that would not be this,
I mean,
the historical equivalent of painting by numbers, which is what one sees.
Well, I think we're fortunate then that we're in such good company that we are working with people who are using Deleuze. Yes.
I'm conscious we're taking up an enormous amount of your time here.
No, that's fine. I just would reiterate again that, having written a book about Deleuze and cinema, obviously I'm a passionate enthusiast for Deleuze, but I think it's fair, I still believe it's fair, I take on board what you're saying, I still believe it's fair to recognise that for a lot of people approaching Deleuze is going to be a hard job. But I think maybe it's for us to say...
It took me 20 years to... Yes. It is formidably difficult. I mean, that's why it's not in film theory and introduction. I just couldn't make head or tail of it.
So maybe that's the good thing that we can do, and it maybe you have to reduce some of these things to something manageable, something you can consume.